All right, today we're talking about one of these supposed evolutionary mysteries. What we're going to sort of take our basic understanding of natural selection and evolution and ask how we can use that to get a more sophisticated understanding of something that might at first seem problematic for this kind of explanation. So you all know natural selection involves differential reproduction. It's often talked about as survival and survival selection, survival of the fittest, that kind of stuff. And it obviously involves adaptation to the biotic environment, which often involves coevolutionary cycles because the biotic environment evolves back at you. It involves adaptation to the physical abiotic environment. And what we're going to focus on more today is that it entails reproduction itself. So a lot of the examples we've used, we've sort of said, well, these ones reproduce and those ones don't. But there's also the whole gradient of relative success at reproduction. There might be a lot that reproduce, but some reproduce a lot more than others. That's differential reproduction as well. And if we're focusing just on differences in success at reproduction, not the survival, not the other components of selection, that's what we call sexual selection. So this was, for a number of years, sort of conceptualized as a distinct, different process from natural selection. But by putting them into this grouping this way, I hope you see it's just one component of natural selection. Sexual selection is one arena in which natural selection plays out. It's just natural selection in terms of reproductive success through competition for mates. So, here's kind of some of this evolutionary problem to solve. Males and females are often different in a variety of features, size, color, feather ornamentation, weaponry like antlers and horns and all this other kinds of stuff. And so the question is, well, why? What's the adaptive mechanism that causes this difference? If natural selection optimizes the fit of individuals to the environment, then why aren't males and females the same? Is kind of an evolutionary question. And the answer is that because reproduction is the ultimate currency of evolution, the environment of males and females is very much not the same. Selection on male reproductive strategy is different than selection on female reproductive strategy because of how males and females reproduce. Those other individuals are part of the relevant environment. The social, sexual environment creates selection pressures that are different from diseases and cold and predators and stuff like that. So here's some just examples of sexual dimorphism. These are male guppies with fancy ornamented fins, bright colors, and fancy, elaborate, longer fins and tails and things like that. Females are fairly cryptic colored. Frogs are dimorphic. Birds are dimorphic in song and coloration. Mammals are often dimorphic. Males in mammals and birds, males are usually bigger than females. This is a graph of human height. If males and females were exactly the same, they'd fall on this line with a slope of 1. But in most populations of humans, males are a little bit taller than females are. That's typical of mammals and birds that males are bigger than females. Fishes, insects, snakes, amphibians, reptiles, females are usually bigger than males. So it's not a whole, and there's lots of exceptions to that anyway. So let's see. Here's one kind of extreme example. This is a male widow bird, which is an African seed-eating bird. This is, the bird is about that big. The tail is about 1 meter long. So that's obviously a fairly ridiculous kind of thing, and you should legitimately ask, how could natural selection produce such a ridiculous tail? What is the function of that tail in the environment? How does it help the male survive? Right? How would natural selection produce this kind of trait? And even if you could concoct some kind of reason why this helps males survive, then you'd immediately be stuck with the question, why don't females have it also? And why don't juveniles have it also? Right? Why do only males in the breeding season produce this ridiculous tail if there were some kind of survival advantage to it? So it's not a weapon. Males don't fight with it or anything like that. The answer that Darwin came up with was sexual selection to explain these kinds of traits. And again, it's a type of natural selection. It's not in opposition to or even strictly different from natural selection. In terms of evolutionary fitness, fitness is transmitting genes to future generations. To do that, you have to reproduce. Right? So not reproducing is genetically the equivalent of dying in terms of transmitting genes to future generation. Reproducing less than others, producing offspring that are low quality and have lousy prospects of survival. That also reduces your evolutionary fitness. That makes reproduction itself something that organisms compete for, not just food and territories and shelters and these kinds of things. It's typically the case that males compete for access to females and that females compete for resources that males may then defend or guard or trade for access to reproductive opportunities, those kinds of things. So males are often going for sort of quantity and females are going more for quality. And we'll look at a lot of the variation around that theme. Those are obviously generalizations, and there's some very instructive exceptions to those kinds of generalizations. So why is it that the usual case, again, there's exceptions, but male gametes are small, female gametes are large. This is one of the trade-offs of size and number of things that we talked about before. What that means is, to make a zygote, you need one sperm and one egg. Male potential reproduction is nearly limitless, whereas female potential reproduction is really, really limited. If males had unlimited access to females, the number of offspring that males could produce would be dozens, hundreds, thousands, in some organisms, tens of thousands, right? The maximum number of offspring that a female could produce is the number of eggs she can fertilize that can become zygotes and go on and develop. Having more and more mates does not necessarily increase female maximum reproductive output. So, because female reproduction is relatively limited, any one reproductive episode is more valuable to females than it is to males. So females should be more selective about who they mate with. Again, it's focusing on quality rather than quantity. And what that means is that females, the consequence of that is that females become a limiting resource for male reproduction, not usually other kinds of resources. So here's classic data from this guy, A.J. Bateman. He did experiments with Drosophila melanogaster in the 1940s. And what he did was he did this repeatedly, reproductive success, fitness, production of offspring, as a function of number of mates for males and females. And guess what? The more females that males mate with, the more kids they have. Not super surprising, right? But by contrast, female fitness goes up if they mate with going from 0 mates to 1 mate. That obviously increases their fitness. But then it tapers off. It might climb a little more gradually. Some recent work even shows it can go down after a while, right? But there's not this super fitness premium on more and more access to additional mating partners. The other really important result from this work is that the variation in male fitness versus female fitness is different. Variation in male fitness is much higher than variation in females. So if you look at the number of mates that these male fruit flies were able to attract, a bunch of males got 0, a bunch of males got 3, most males were in the middle. So here's the distribution, here's some average, and there's quite a bit of variation. Females, on the other hand, almost all females mated, very, very few mated with 4. The average might be very similar, but the variation is much less. Right? So that's variation in number of mating partners differs between males and females in this important way. And if you look at the variation in reproductive success, on a bunch of these slides I'll probably abbreviate reproductive success as RS, but it's fitness. It's the same thing, right? So if you look at the ratio of male variance to female variance, in each of the replicates of his experiments, male fitness was more variable than female fitness. What does that tell you something about the strength of selection on males versus females? Think back to when we talked about selection differential versus selection gradient. Selection gradient is the selection differential divided by the trait variance. The strength of selection is very much dependent on how much variation there is in the traits. So the variation in male reproduction exceeding the variation in female reproduction suggests there's much stronger, and that it's associated with fitness, suggests there's much stronger selection on male access to females than there is on female access to males. Below here, there's data on the maximum number of offspring produced during the lifetime of 3 species that are polygamous, meaning males mate with multiple females if they can. Those are elephant seals, red deer, and humans. Then the last species, the kittiwake gull, is a monogamous species. Males and females, they mate with each other, partnered up for life. So what you see in these polygynous species, that the maximum number of offspring produced over the lifetime for males far exceeds the maximum number of offspring produced by females. So, for example, elephant seals, males fight, they have these harems of females on the beach. If you are the alpha male who controls a harem of females, you mate with all or nearly all of those females. If you are a successful male elephant seal, you might have 100 kids. A whole bunch of other males are losers and have none, right? Lots of variation. Female elephant seal has 1 pup per year. If she lives 8 years as a reproductive adult, she can have 8 kids. There's not a lot of variation in female reproductive output. Humans, this guy had 888 kids. His name was Moulay Ismail the Bloodthirsty. He was emperor of Morocco. Guess what kind of mating system they had? A harem mating system. He was the emperor of Morocco. He had reproductive access to large numbers of females in the harem. The female was a Russian woman who had a whole series of triplets and quintuplets. This is before Nadia Suleiman and all this kind of crazy ramped up reproductive technology. These were natural twins and triplets and stuff. Now, by contrast, let me try to get rid of this stuff so you can see it. The kittiwake gull, oops. You have one male paired with one female. They have a nest. They share parenting duties. They raise the kids together. The only way the male gets more kids is if the female also gets more kids. So the reproductive output in monogamous mating systems, at least genetically monogamous ones, is equal between males and females. The relative variance, the strength of sexual selection is the same on males and females in those kinds of species. So the strength of selection is related to differential variation in mating success. So in males, the typical case is you have some that have quite a few and some that have none, with most in the middle. Females, the variation is much narrower in total reproductive output. Okay, so if we're going from this, what would predict is that because male fitness is so tied to numbers of mates where female fitness is not, would predict males should compete for females. That's called intrasexual selection. And males can compete directly, like fighting each other, or they can also compete for resources that are needed by females. And would predict that females should be choosy, picky about who they mate with. Quality, not quantity. That's called intersexual selection, where females are choosing for resources or high-quality males. Could be good fathers, could be good genetics for their kids, things that increase the quality and survivorship of their offspring, not just the numbers of their offspring. So, Darwin proposed this roughly almost 20 years after he published On the Origin of Species, published his ideas about sexual selection, and this idea of male-male competition was pretty readily accepted. It seems very intuitive, right, that males have these traits that you can describe function to them by males fighting for territories and resources and all kinds of stuff. So these aren't super difficult to understand, but some of them aren't nearly as intuitive as others. So this is this example here of male iguanas. These are Galapagos marine iguanas fighting over territories, and they ones that get better territories have higher reproductive success with females because the females prefer those high-quality territories. So on any given island on the Galapagos, males are larger than females, but there's a lot of variation between islands and how big they are. So here's on Santa Fe Island, males and females. Males have this peak size up here. Females have a peak size down here. You get a similar kind of thing on Genovesa. They're all much smaller, but the males have a larger body size than females do. And you can look at what's the selection on body size just from survival, not reproduction, and figure out what's the best body size for getting food and living. And in each of those cases, that's marked by this asterisk, females never exceed that optimum size. They can be smaller than that, and they're still growing. Right? Males often exceed that optimum size from a optimum from a survivorship point of view. So if you're looking at body size as a trait that's under survival selection, you would have a problem explaining the body sizes of males. They're bigger than they ought to be from the survival point of view alone. So we're going to explain that departure based not on survival selection, but on male-male competition and reproductive sexual selection. So here's iguana territories, and in there is marked the number of mates that these different iguana males got. Some territories were very much favored by females. These things jump into the ocean. I don't know if you know how much you know about marine iguanas. They jump into the ocean, swim down, and they feed on algae. And the water's pretty cold most of the year. Then they come out of the water to digest that food and grow and all that stuff. They have to warm up. So then they sit on these black lava rocks and bask to warm up to be able to digest their food and do stuff. So these basking sites are important to the lizard's physiology and being able to digest their food and get warm up to go back in the water, feed more and stuff like that. So here's the distribution of numbers of copulations by number of males. You see that one guy got 45 mates. One guy got 10, and a whole bunch got few or none. Extreme variation in male mating success, right? Related to where their territories are. And the females go where the good territories resources are for basking, and then the males fight over those. And you can observe fights between males and see that larger males are more likely to win fights. Not too surprising to most of you, right? The ones, there's selection on male body size for fighting for the resources that females want. And if you look at that variation in mating success from 45 mates down to a lot of males getting 0, that's pretty strong selection on male body size, which explains why it's pushed, why body size is pushed larger than that naturally selected optimum. So it looks something kind of like this. Here's body size. Here's the number of males. There's this distribution of body size. Natural selection has an optimum body size down here. So natural selection is pushing this way. Natural selection meaning survival selection in terms of food, right? And there's sexual selection pushing this way. Sexual selection, which is also natural selection, but it is a different component of natural selection, pushing males to these body sizes that are suboptimal in terms of foraging and survivorship. But if you are, do you want to live forever and have an optimal body size and not have any mates? Or would you rather have a suboptimal body size, win some territories, and have lots of mates? Doesn't matter what you'd prefer. The ones that are here now had ancestors that selected the more mates option. That's why they're here now. Okay. So, now what's happening? All right. So fighting is ought to be super intuitive, at least to things like antlers and horns and sharp teeth and claws and big body sizes. But there are less intuitive ways that males compete. One of them is related to what we talked about with the bats and testes size. It's called sperm competition. If multiple males mate with the same female, we talk about competition for access to mates, access to females. Mating with a female doesn't do you any evolutionary good if your sperm are not used to fertilize any eggs. So when multiple males mate with a female, there's competition among those sperm to be the sperm used to fertilize the eggs. That's when you get zygotes, right? So in species where females mate multiply, that sets up a whole level of male-male competition that's not nearly as intuitive as fighting with antlers. But males fight for mechanisms of fertilization success. Here's examples in insects called damselflies, which are sort of like dragonflies, but they mate in this, what's called a wheel formation. The male produces sperm at the tip of his abdomen, but then transfers it to right here. This is the male that's blue, and the female is kind of brown underneath. The male then grabs the female behind the head with the tip of his abdomen, and if she's interested in mating, she curls her abdomen around under, like this. She curls her abdomen around under, and that's where sperm transfer takes place. In insects, females don't get pregnant. They store sperm. The eggs get fertilized when the eggs are laid into the environment. That's when fertilization takes place. So there are these sperm storage organs in insects which might contain the sperm of a number of different males. So males do all kinds of things to try to increase the chances that their sperm are the ones used for fertilization, not the other guy's sperm. So here's kind of a close-up of the actual act right there, the sex. And if you look at close-ups of damselfly penises, they have these structures to move the sperm of other males away, to remove it out of the female's sperm storage organ, to pack it into the back recesses. Male sperm also have all these accessory chemicals packed with them that change female reproductive tract chemistry, that attack other sperm. There's all kinds of really crazy stuff going on. Here's this one on the bottom is a species where this is the tip of the penis and there's this sort of flagellar whip thing off of it. And this is a blow-up of that whip, and you can see these backwards pointing spines. that physically remove the sperm of other males before this male deposits his own sperm. You have a perfectly logical evolutionary explanation of that trait, given reproductive competition is what evolution is about, and you wouldn't have a decent explanation of that kind of trait otherwise. You could make something up, but that's a good explanation. Here's some other crazy things that happen in the world. Brace yourself. So this is the sperm of a Drosophila hydei. The fly is, a 2 to 3 millimeter fruit fly, like your normal fruit fly. The sperm is almost an inch long. It's 10 times the length of the male is the sperm. This is an Argentine lake duck, and what looks like its intestines hanging out is actually its penis. You're like, ducks have penises? Most birds don't have penises, but ostriches, waterfowl, they do. And basically, this long coiled penis is used when males mob females and try to mate with them, whether the females are interested or not. Female reproductive tract is also really long and convoluted as a sort of counter adaptation to these males. So there's coevolution and, in a sense, an arms race between male morphology and female morphology in these things. Let's see, what else? We talked about bats and testes size. You can also look at the structure of primate penises. There's all kinds of weird features about penises. If a penis is just supposed to be an efficiently designed tube to get sperm from the outside into the inside of the reproductive tract, then you wouldn't predict that there would be all these hooks and spines and knobs and weird things that penises have, right? It's not just acting as a sperm delivery vehicle. It's doing other stuff too that you can explain in terms of sexual selection, sperm competition, and female choice as well, which we'll get to female choice. Let's see. Here's another way that males compete. So it seems unintuitive, but sometimes males kill the offspring of females. And when they do it, it's usually the offspring of females that were conceived with some other male, not their own offspring. Killing your own offspring is usually selected against. Not always, but it usually is. But when, for example, male lions take over a pride, the pups that are there, they're not called pups, what are they? Cubs, that's what it is. The cubs are the cubs that were fathered by the males that they kicked out. It's pretty likely that those males the new males, will themselves be kicked out within only a few years. So it's in their evolutionary interest to have kids as fast as possible. By killing the cubs from the previous males, the females come into estrus sooner, which allows those males to reproduce and have cubs sooner. They only kill the young cubs that are nursing. Older cubs they don't kill because those ones are not inhibiting female estrus. So by killing those kids that are nursing on the females, they have the opportunity to mate sooner. That's a form of male-male reproductive competition that's less intuitive than just beating the snot out of each other. That kind of infanticide happens in a variety of groups, including some primate species. Here's a picture of red colobus monkeys, but Langer monkeys also do it, and others. Okay. Now I said that these are the sex roles that are typical of most species. And I said that there's some instructive examples that are the reverse. Those are called sex role reversed kinds of examples, where males become the choosy sex and females compete for access to males. So the reason let's recap. What's the reason that the non-sex role reversed normal, in quotes, situation arises is because access to females limits male reproduction more than access to females. I'm going to start over. The normal situation is that male reproduction is limited by access to females more than female reproduction is limited by access to males. That's the normal situation. In sex role reverse species, what's happening is that access to males limits female reproduction more than access to females limits male reproduction. And you get those kinds of reversals when males provide a large investment in the offspring. If they are the ones that do all of the parenting or care for the kids or provide all of the resources or something like that, then female fitness can be limited by access to the resources that those males provide. So an example here is where males invest more is seahorses and pipefish, those kinds of things where males, I don't know, I hope you know, but you might not know, seahorses and pipefish, males have a pouch and then these fathers get sort of pregnant. There's actually external fertilization, but then the eggs are deposited into the male pouch, and he becomes the sole parent and caretaker of those kids. So females can then swim off and produce more eggs and could produce more kids by mating with more males and having them take care of those kids, right? But males are limited in the amount of offspring they can produce by the size of their pouch and how many they can take care of. So, when this has been studied, male pipefish are the selective ones. And they want to mate with females that are big and healthy looking and have lots of eggs, rather than waste their time taking care of a few offspring of females that are nasty and sickly looking and this kind of stuff. So these are just data showing that males will reject females if they're too small, measured as either body size, or this is a measure of female condition, how much energetic reserve she has. And they also don't like females that have lots of spots that are caused by parasites. And you can prove it that they're visually assessing female status by, instead of giving females parasites, you can give them tattoos that look like parasites, and then the males don't like them either. Right? So males are not just like, oh yeah, more females the better. In these species, these sexual reverse species, males are a limited resource for female reproduction, and the males become picky about which females they'll mate with. So it's this relative investment in reproduction. Basically, which sex invests more in the kids is the pickier sex, and the other sex competes for access to that limited resource. So, speaking of being picky, back to the normal situation. What's called female choice could be male choice in the case of pipefish and sexual role reverse species, or mutual mate choice in monogamous type species. Males and female reproduction is both limited by the quality of the partner. So there's mutual mate choice, right? But this was developed by Darwin and later workers mostly as female mate choice, because it's usually males that are ornamented in birds and sing songs, like in frogs and crickets and these other sorts of things, and females select among potential males. So here's an example from the book and a lot of recent literature on barn swallows, which this work was done in Denmark. Barn swallow lives worldwide. There are different populations. You can see them in North America. But this work was done with European populations, and males have these kind of, you can't really see it here, they have a kind of long forked tail. Females have a forked tail too, but it's not as long. So here's data showing tail length of females and males, and you can see that there's dimorphism in tail length, right? The average male tail is quite a bit bigger than the average female tail length, and this how forked it is. And this guy, Anders Moller, manipulated tail length in an experiment where he'd cut off their tails and glue them back on, and had experimental controls for manipulating them and this kind of stuff. And then he would look at, well, how long does it take for them to attract a mate if they have a shortened tail versus a long tail? And then his controls are in the middle. These are two different kinds of controls. And because these things, they fly, he did his work in Denmark, they fly from North Africa up to Denmark in the spring. They have to pair up, have kids, and get out of there before it becomes winter again. So how quickly you pair up is actually an important part of your reproductive success, because if you do it really soon, you might actually be able to get off 2 sets of offspring in that European summer before you go back. So here's the elongated tail, males with elongated tails paired up quickly. Ones that had shortened tails took a long time to attract a mate. You can tell that these are ornaments because when they're pairing up, the males fly around right in front of the female, and the female flies right behind the forked tail, like, wow, nice tail, or whatever she's thinking. So this pairing up early matters because you can see here, this is the percent of second clutches, second sets of offspring as a function of tail length. Males that had the elongated tails paired up early, and so roughly 60% of them or so were able to get 2 sets of offspring in that year. These shortened ones that took longer to attract a mate, had very few of them did that. So here's the total number of fledglings as a function of tail length. It's hard to measure reproductive success in the wild. When birds fledge, they fly away and leave. So lots of these studies use fledging success as kind of a measure of reproductive success. And you can see that these ones with this, it's not a weapon, they're not fighting each other with it, nothing like that. This is an ornament that is selected by female preference. Now, the other thing that Moller did in other studies is he looked at whether or not these birds fool around on the side. So these are socially monogamous birds. You have one male and one female as a pair, but that doesn't mean that they're genetically monogamous. They can have a little hanky-panky on the side, and those are called extra-pair copulations. Extra-pair meaning outside of the pair. And then you can look at of the males with shortened tails. Come on. Males with shortened tails, none of them were able to fool around. No one wanted to fool around with them. Males with longer tails were found willing partners elsewhere. And then you can also look at whether they're social mates, whether their females fooled around or not. The males with longer tails, their females didn't fool around with other birds, and the males that had shortened tails, their partners did fool around with other birds. And these data are just behavioral observations of what birds do, but this has been followed up with genetic data assessing paternity of offspring, and it tells the same story, that longer tails mean more kids, and it means more kids because females prefer you as a mate. Here's another example with gray tree frogs. The males produce these calls that you can hear from a distance to attract females, and females have song preferences. These kinds of traits are really good to work with because all you have to do is have a tape recorder and a laptop or whatever. You can play back these calls, you can manipulate them. You don't have to have the males cooperate and do anything. You can do nice experiments just by varying the playbacks that you provide. So here's a female in the middle, and she has in the middle of 2 loudspeakers that produce either a long call, typical of some males, or a short call, typical of some males, and 30 choose the long call, 10 choose the short call. So there's a 3-to-1. I mean, if there were no difference, your null expectation would be roughly 20 and 20, right? So there's some preference for these long calls, and there's a similar kind of preference for fast calls over slow calls. And then what's cool about this is the researchers did a follow-up experiment where instead of having the speakers be equally far from the female frog, they had the one with the unattractive call be closer to the female and the one with the attractive call be farther away. And the female would actually bypass this close, unattractive call in order to go to a farther away, more attractive call at a rate of 38 to 15. They'll bypass this, weird sounding, ugly call. So, there's evolutionary mystery number 1 solved. Males have these weird traits because of competition for mates, in part because females prefer them. But that kind of immediately gets you stuck into evolutionary mystery number 2, which is why do females prefer these kinds of traits? Why are females choosy? Female choosiness is itself a trait that evolves. Females don't have to be that way. You evolutionarily need to explain, well, why are these preferences what they are? And there's a variety of different things that might account for this. It could be that there's benefits to the females of expressing those mate preferences. Basically, maybe the females that have this preference for these longer, faster calls end up with better genes for their offspring. Maybe they end up with better territories or more resources, or just males that have more food or whatever. Another category of explanation is maybe there is no benefit. Maybe just as females' sensory systems process input, that there's some kind of bias in that sensory system, that where perhaps that bias is selected in another context. So perhaps lots of birds like the color red on males because they're attracted to red berries. So there's selection on the preference for red from foraging, because berries are red, but then that gets translated to a preference for males with red feathers or whatever because of how the female nervous system processes the color red. Is this kind of idea of no benefit, but that it is no benefit in the context of mating, but that it's selected in some other kind of part of phylogenetic history. And then the most complicated one is this idea of runaway coevolution, which is, we'll go into in some detail, but the idea here is there's not really any naturally selected benefit in terms of survival or the quality of the offspring, but just if you mate with an attractive male, you'll have sons that other females find attractive. And that can then cause this kind of self-reinforcing evolution of the male attractive traits and the female preferences for those attractive traits. So we'll look at those in more detail. Yeah, Kia.
So how does this affect natural selection? Like if they're working against each other, how does it affect that trait?
It depends on the relative strengths of selection. So there's actually a lot of very interesting interplay. When females prefer traits that indicate that males have good genes for surviving in the current environment, then that directly favors the female preference for those traits and those males that have good survivorship, and then their kids have good survivorship. But you could also have the situation where you have these arbitrary attractive traits that they're just attractive because they're attractive, which then are opposed by natural selection. So these traits in males get optimized. What you see as phenotypic variation in the world is the optimal trade-off between survival selection and sexual selection. But it varies depending on what kind of thing we're talking about here. Okay. Hopefully we'll see with some of these kind of examples that maybe you'll see some of these benefits. So let's see. The gray tree frog example that you just heard about with these long and short calls. Alison Welch did this really cool study with these frogs. showing that the female preference is maintained by genetic benefits to offspring. What's so cool about this study is frogs have external fertilization. So she was able to make sets of frogs for her studies that were half siblings, because she could take a female, squeeze out the eggs, there's a bunch of eggs, divide them into two groups, and then fertilize this group with the sperm of a male with a long call, fertilize that group with the sperm of a male with a short call. And then everything else about them is exactly the same. When we talked about doing good experiments, you want to have everything other than what you're manipulating the same. Because she could use external fertilization in these frogs, she had whole sets of half-siblings and half-siblings. Then she did it over and over and over again, where the only difference between them was the calls, the song characteristic, the call of their genetic father. And so then she would compare all these different fitness measures: larval growth, time to metamorphosis, mass at metamorphosis, their survival, post-metamorphic growth. Should compare them between these half-sibling groups. The only difference is what their father's genotype was. And she replicated it with a whole bunch of different frogs, but also replicated it across 2 years. And she replicated it with, they had high food and low food kind of differences. And then she compared their performance. If it says NSD, that means no significant difference. It means they were the same on average statistically. And then it could say LC better, meaning the offspring of the long call males, their performance was better than the offspring of the short call males, which there are a bunch of those. It could also say short call, the offspring of short call males do better. But there aren't any of those up there, because the offspring of the short call males never did better than the offspring of the long call males. So the only difference, again, between all these frogs is the genotypes of their fathers. Even the genotype of the mother is controlled in the experiment because of this external fertilization. So there's selection on the female preference for long calls, because there's something about those males, that call indicates something about the genetics of that male that makes their kids survive better and grow better and that kind of thing. In which case, sexual selection and natural selection for this call property are not in opposition, but there could be, of course, maybe predators find males with long calls easier than predators find males with short calls. There could be other sorts of selection on these calling characteristics. Let's see. Example with resources. Females select males for resources if female reproduction is often limited by access to resources rather than access to males. Here's some nice examples with these things called hanging flies, where males they catch, they're a type of insect, and they catch other insects as food items for the female. And then, so this is a male, and he has, no, I'm sorry, this is the male, and he's given the female here this insect to eat. And while she's sitting there eating it, he has sex with her. And when she's done eating with it, she's done with him. And she, kicks him off of there. So what you see is that the duration of copulation is related to the size of the food item. They call it nuptial prey item, but whatever. It's basically a dinner date, right? Up to a certain point, there's a nice positive relationship. I'm going to erase that so you can see the data. The bigger the food item, the longer they copulate, and the longer they copulate, the more sperm are transferred. Right? So there's selection on males to catch these big food items to give these resources to females, which the females then turn into lots of eggs, and it increases their fecundity. It tapers off at about 20 minutes of copulation, because that's about when the number of sperm transferred tapers off as well. Right? So there's just selection on males to have these food items. There's enough selection on males to have these food items that some males will try to pick insects out of spider webs at their own peril. Instead of catching them themselves, they'll try to get them from spider webs, and sometimes they get killed in the spider web. Males that can't get good food resources, if they have eaten themselves but don't have a current food resource, they'll make a big mass of saliva proteins, and they'll give that to the female, like, here's some really proteinaceous spit. How about we have sex? And then some males that are real losers, they'll just grab females, say, sorry, I don't have any food, but let's still do this, right? That happens too. So here's this this other sort of category, not a last category, of no benefit. And the idea here is not that there's no selection on the female preference, but that the selection on the female preference is in a different evolutionary context than the mating preference. So that's why these are called pre-existing sensory biases. So all mating preferences are thought by biologists to be sensory biases. No one is imagining that female frogs are going, wow, that's a really attractive song. I'm sure he has good genes for my offspring and they'll survive better if I mate with him instead of him. There's just something about the way their sensory system and brain processes that stimulus input that says, I want that guy instead of that guy. And if they have that kind of sensory bias and mate with that guy and end up with more kids, then that favors that sensory bias. If they had a sensory bias that made them mate with some guy that caused them to have fewer or worse kids, what would be the selection on that sensory bias? If you have a sensory bias that makes your fitness worse, what happens to that sensory bias? It should go away. The sensory biases, the way the nervous system processes sensory input, should be maintained if it leads to high fitness and should be eliminated if it leads to low fitness. No one is imagining that these organisms have these, cognitive kind of comparison. But pre-existing sensory biases work the same, but they've been selected at some other point in evolution in some other context. So these water mites, the idea here is that females, so here's a female water mite, and she's up on her back legs like this in what's called this net stance, which is basically a hunting pose. And then when other little arthropods come into the water column, I'll make water blue, and if they're other little insects and food items vibrating the water there, then she grabs them and eats them. So this pose has evolved in the context of hunting. This female neural sensory response to vibrations in the water column is adaptive. It is selected for in a hunting context, but in a mating context, you have the male water mites that sneak up close to them, not so close that they can get grabbed, and then they use their legs to make water vibrations that the females respond to. And the females respond as though they're responding to a foraging cue for food. Right? So this male behavioral sort of display trait is triggering or exploiting a sensory bias that exists in the females before that kind of mating display evolved. And you can do cool experiments. People have done cool experiments with this. They'll test the responses of females that are either hungry or not hungry. Females that are not fed and hungry respond to these male vibration cues more than females that have been fed, showing that this is really evolved in this kind of foraging context. The pre-existing part is tested using a phylogeny. So you would like to know whether these female preferences and the male traits evolved at the same time or if one evolved before the other. How you find out if traits evolved coevolutionarily or one evolved before the other is by doing trait distributions on a phylogeny and using parsimony, the kind of stuff we talked about a while ago. So here's a phylogeny of water mite species, and what you can see is all of these females here with green use the net stance behavior as part of their hunting strategy. So you would infer that the net stance thing was gained as an evolutionary trait in the common ancestor of all of those species. So you infer that that's when that evolutionary transition occurred. Now you ask, well, do males use this particular part of courtship? And those species do, except this one doesn't, right? So it could be the case that those two traits were gained together right here, which would be coevolution, not indicating pre-existing sensory bias, or just as equally parsimonious, it could be that the net stance was gained here, and then the male traits were gained there and there, in which case it would be pre-existing. Right? And unfortunately for this story, neither one is more parsimonious than the other. So it could be either one. But there are other examples of sensory biases that do appear to have, the phylogeny appears to more clearly support that the female preference existed before the male traits arose to kind of exploit those kinds of preferences. So, stalk-eyed flies. If I didn't study crickets, I would study stalk-eyed flies. These things are so cool. Let's see if I can make this work right. Look at this. You see that? That is a fly with its eyeballs out here. That's why it's called a stalk-eyed fly. That is so cool. Anyway. A bunch of work on these things. Males with longer eye stalks have bigger bodies. They're more likely to win fights. So that's male-male competition has favored this trait. Female stalk-eyed flies. Females' eyeballs are also out on eye stalks. They're just not nearly, they're kind of like here instead of here. They're a little bit out there. Females prefer males with longer eye stalks. So it's also evolving through female preference. There's a whole bunch of complicated genetics behind this where it turns out that males with long eye stalks produce sperm with a Y chromosome bias. That's a lie. They don't have X and Y chromosomes. Their sex determination is different. But they produce more sons than males with short eye stalks. And in a population that is female biased, if the sex ratio is female biased, we talked before about what's the average fitness of males and females in a female biased sex ratio population. Think back. If there's more females than males, what's the average fitness of females versus males? All the kids are produced by a male and a female. So if there's a lot more females than males, then on average, males have higher fitness than females. Right? We talked about it with frequency-dependent selection. So there's an additional reason why females in female-biased populations might prefer to mate with males with long eye stalks, because those males are going to produce lots of sons that would have high fitness in a female sex-biased population. It's kind of complicated. Don't worry about it if you didn't get it. The important part about this example is it illustrates this idea of runaway sexual selection, that last category of male-female coevolution, where it's just the production of sexy sons is the explanation for these traits. And this explanation relies on there being a genetic correlation between the male trait genes and the female preference genes. So, here's male eye stalks that go from short to long, and there's genetic variation that underlies this phenotypic variation. And I can't really see it. Stop it. Now you really can't see it. Go back. Oh, it screwed it up good. Go back. No, it's going to keep that. Nope. All right. Oh, I figured out what it is. If I do this, it goes black. Then I know. Should we do an experimental test? We can't. We're not satisfied with science without replication. We have a prediction. Black. Not. Black. Okay, I think we figured it out. All right. Female preference variation with genetic variation underlying it, right? Now, what happens is females that prefer males with long eye stalks, who are they more likely to mate with? It's not a trick question. Males with long eye stalks. Females that prefer males with shorter eye stalks, who are they more likely to mate with? Okay, so these ones mate with these ones. These ones mate with these ones. So you get this association between the female preference genes and the male trait genes. So that's called assortative mating. Right? The ones that there is not, when we talked about non-random mating in Hardy-Weinberg part, this is non-random mating with respect to eye stalk and eye stalk preference loci. And what it does is it causes a genetic correlation or linkage between the preference genes and the male trait genes. So the kids of this pairing here, what kind of genes do they have? They have long eye genes. What kind of preference genes do they have? Long eye preference genes. Doesn't matter if they're males or females. Males and females inherit long eye preference genes and long eye genes. The males express the long eye genes, the females express the long eye preference genes, but they both inherit both, right? These ones produce kids, males and females, with short eye genes and short eye preference genes. Now you have genetic linkage between preference and trait alleles, right? This is an example of genetic linkage that does not depend on them being on the same chromosomes or even anywhere physically near. This is just statistical linkage between these different genes. You have lots of different loci that underlie male eye stalks and female preferences, and they're associated non-randomly. There's genetic linkage that's called a genetic correlation between them, even though there's no association of the alleles physically on chromosomes. So what happens in this scenario is now another female comes along. We'll put her over here. Oh, I'm already in blue. Here's a female. Those are her eyes, little eyes. She likes the long eye stalk. She has a long eye stalk preference genes. She mates with this guy who has long eye stalks. Her long eye stalk preference is selecting for long eye stalks. No surprise, because she mates with this guy with his long eye stalks. What are her long eye stalk preference genes also selecting for? The preference genes. These long eye stalk preference genes cause her to mate with a male who has long eye stalks and also has long eye stalk preference genes. The long eye stalk preference genes are selecting for themselves in this kind of scenario. It only happens because they're genetically correlated. And you only get that genetic correlation because of the assortative mating between male traits and female preferences. That's what allows this Fisherian runaway to proceed. Oh, back to plants. All right, so this is called Fisherian runaway sexual selection, named after the same guy, Sir Ronald Fisher, that we talked about before. And basically, it can cause rapid evolution of the male trait and the female preferences, without there being some kind of magic benefit in terms of offspring survivorship or something like that. In principle, it works just by the production of attractive sons, and that the female preference genes select for themselves because of they're genetically linked to the male trait genes. So it's a self-reinforcing process. That's why it's called runaway. Okay. Plants. Plants also produce gametes that are big and small. If they produce lots of little gametes, we call those pollen. We call that male reproductive function. Few large gametes are the ovules in the plant's ovary, right? We call that female reproductive function. They have all this ornamentation related to attracting pollinators to move their gametes around. So you can think of plants as having mating success related to sexually selected ornamental traits, the same way that animals have ornamental traits that are related to reproduction, not survivorship kind of selection. There's a lot of correspondence between the theory of animal sexual selection and what you think about plants. All of these things are true in plants that have directly analogous situations in animal sexual selection. So you have these large, numerous, small male gametes, females that are large and limited. Females make this extra investment. Reproduction through male function will be limited by access to these large female ovules. Female ovules aren't going to be limited by access to pollen, mostly. So you would expect pollen to compete for pollinators more than ovules would compete for pollinators. In other words, pollinators might limit male reproductive success more than female reproductive success. And there's a lot of cool data on this now, comparing sometimes the same physical flower is both male and female, right? But once it has pollen arrive on the female parts, its female reproductive function is done. But it stays in business exporting pollen it can still increase its fitness by exporting pollen to other flowers. So if you look at the pollinator attraction to the ornaments of flowers and look at, does that affect fitness through female function, which would be seed set, versus fitness through male function, which would be export of pollen, you find lots of examples where you can associate the ornamental features, say yellow versus white, with paternal function. There's excess reproduction through male function, and it doesn't make any difference. This is 50-50 through maternal function. So whether your flowers are yellow or white in this wild radish doesn't make any difference to how many of your ovules get fertilized and produce seeds. But it makes a big difference to how much of your pollen gets exported out into the rest of the population to produce seeds on some other plant, right? This is a kind of complicated graph. We don't have time to go through the whole thing, really. But you can get the whole essence of this graph by asking, what do wind-pollinated flowers look like? Wind-pollinated flowers don't have to attract pollinators. They're not competing for pollinator visits. Wind-pollinated flowers are usually up high, inconspicuous. They don't smell. They don't have bright colors. They produce tons of pollen that just blows everywhere. So all the grasses and all the pines and all the oaks are all wind-pollinated things. They don't have the kinds of sexually selected ornamentation that you get in animal pollinated flowers. Then you can also compare the structure of flowers, their ornamentation, and their smell if they're female-only flowers and male-only flowers. So some species of plants have both in the same flower, but others have them separated, right? The male-only flowers are consistently nicer smell and bigger corollas and greater showiness than the female counterparts within the same species. So that's that differential effect of male pollen export. So buy your date. Should you buy your date female flowers or male flowers? All right, so we're assuming that you actually want to attract your date. You should get them male flowers because they're going to be showier and smell nicer than female flowers. Is there anything else here? No.